So, welcome to this special edition of Defend Your Faith on this beautiful end of June day, almost getting into July as we get into Independence Day and we think about our country and our country's past and where we've gone from here. And the culture wars really define American life and politics. But where did all this division in our country start? Well, there's a good argument that it began 100 years ago this coming month, July 1925, with the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee. And the issue at hand was teaching of evolution and creation in public schools. So if you're not familiar with the story, in the early 1900s, evolution was really coming to the fore as a common viewpoint among scientists. And the views at the time were strongly opposed to Christian faith. For instance, the scientific view at that time, it isn't the view today, but the view at that time was that the Earth and the universe didn't necessarily have a beginning, and they called that the steady state universe. And today we're seeing the pendulum go the other way, and a lot of scientists are actually coming back to faith in a creator, even though society is moving further and further away from Christian beliefs. But back then it was starting to be viewed as unintelligent to believe in God. And that was a big shift from how it was in early America, because at the time of the Founding Fathers, not everyone was a Christian, but everybody had a respect for the Bible. But by the 1920s, that was changing. And so in 1925, Tennessee, which was a conservative state, passed a law to ban the teaching of evolution in school. And for the first time in American history, you had lobbying groups who actually worked to recruit someone to disobey the law. And the idea was to try to challenge the law. And John Scopes, a teacher, agreed to disobey so the case could end up in court. At the time, radio had just begun to be the first mass media, so the trial was aired across the nation in a way that wouldn't have been possible even a couple years before that. William Jennings Bryan, who had run for president several times, defended the state's law and the creationist position. And Clarence Darrow, a high-profile lawyer, argued for evolution. And here's a photo. You might have seen this in some of your history books, but these are the two men that took up this case and argued for their respective positions. That's William Jennings Bryan is the man on the left, and Clarence Darrow is on the right. And legally, the case was relatively insignificant. All that was at stake was a fine that amounted to about $1,700 in current money. But it brought the origins debate to the public square, and for the first time, Christian faith was publicly ridiculed and debated in the U.S. I'm here with apologist Kelly Clemenson, who can tell me a bit more about the significance of the Scopes trial and what we can learn from it. So, Kelly, how do you think the Scopes trial changed America? And particularly, how did it change public education?
Yeah, absolutely. There was an attempt to make it so that Christians didn't really understand the origins of the universe for matter and the earth as well. And this started to be, the 1800s started to be a bad time for Christians. A lot of things happened, including Charles Darwin and his theory, which caught fire, more with scientific computing and secularism than it did. But the problem was Christians didn't really have a good answer for it. They didn't have a way to defend their faith. Things that hadn't come along, the idea of the cell being simple protoplasm was thought to be true. We know that now is not the case, which pretty much destroys evolution. But they didn't know that at that point. And what they went for the idea that since we are teaching creationism, which is just logic, then we needed to also include evolution, which isn't logical. But we know that now. We didn't know it then. We didn't think about it then. But what they're aiming at is they're aiming at the foundations of our faith, the foundations that we have always felt that if you were created, there was a design involved and there was a reason for you being here. Whereas if you were taught that you're here by accident, then maybe you'll start acting like you're an accident.
Right.
So that's my big complaint against the idea of teaching evolution in schools. But if they were to teach it truthfully, then that would be one thing. But they're not teaching it truthfully. They're teaching it as fact, and it's even a very poor hypothesis, even to that point. Hypothesis, theory, law. Even at that point, it's not even a very good hypothesis because it doesn't really have any foundations for it. And that's the reason why I feel that it shouldn't be taught at all. But if you're going to teach it in the schools, then at least teach it equally.
Right.
Have somebody there to teach the creation part, and then someone there to say, okay, well, this is our other idea. There are schools that do that, and we know about them. And I think when you teach it honestly, the bulk of the majority of people are going to fall on the side of Christianity and creation. So I think this was something that was aimed at the foundations of Christianity, and the people that wanted to do it that way because, like most people, they don't want to be responsible for their actions. And if you don't have a God around that's created a moral base for you to follow, then you don't really have to worry about that. You can use what man comes up as what I call mores, or as if the majority agrees on it, that's what they want to do.
Right.
It's subjective, not objective morality, and I believe that started with the idea that Charles Darwin came around with. You can tell some stories about Charles, why he may have came to that point, but that's where it came from. And it was a way, like the gentleman that was after him, and his name doesn't come to mind right away, but one of Charles Darwin was actually he wasn't a real bold speaker. He wasn't out challenging things directly. There was another guy around, and I can't think of his name. We'll plug it in. But he was the one that actually was a firebrand for evolution. And what his idea was we wanted to get Genesis out of science.
Right.
And that was his statement. And we'll get his name. We'll plug it in. But that was his idea: get Genesis out of science, and use science to aim at the Christian faith. And like you said, make people think that if you're intellectual, then you can't be a Christian, which is definitely not true. I just read recently, it's just a sidetrack, the man with the highest IQ that is in the world right now is a foundational Christian. And he feels that way because it's the best evidence for it. And an IQ of 267, I've never heard of such thing.
Yeah, that's incredible.
What he's got. That's incredible IQ. But he's a believing Christian, and he believes that way, not because he was raised, like a lot of people try to say, well, you're raised as a Christian, you'll be a Christian. That wasn't the reason. He said he looked into both of them, and his best evidence is for Christianity. So this whole idea of Christians not being able to be intellectual, that's just a ploy. It's a ploy of secular society and atheism. You'll get that when you talk to an atheist. They're probably going to tell you you're Christian because you were raised that way, or a Muslim you were raised that way, and you haven't really studied anything. And if you actually got into it intellectually, then you would give up on it, which I find to be exactly the opposite.
And 3 months ago, we had the privilege of meeting one of the most intelligent Christians, as far as, and Christianity isn't based on having high intelligence, but it is impressive to meet people who are gifted that way and are part of our faith. And we had the privilege of meeting one astrophysicist, Hugh Ross, and you may not agree with Hugh. Ross does believe in the millions of years, but he doesn't believe that evolution happened. He believed that the creation days were long periods of time. But he is an extremely intelligent man, and he grew up in an atheistic background. He didn't have a connection with Christianity, and he came to faith because he felt that there had to be a designer of the universe, and he felt that of the religions of the world, Christianity was the only one that made sense.
Yeah. And he's an evangelist as well, and he's, like Daniel said, he's a very intelligent man, and he has no problem being a Christian based on looking at things on an intellectual basis. Like Daniel said, Christianity is simple enough for a 5-year-old to understand it. I know that because that's who told me about it. But it's also foundational and deep enough for any intellectual that wants to look into it to come out with a positive attitude towards it.
So one of the big shifts in American society after the Scopes trial was that Christians became a lot more timid about sharing their faith publicly, because they knew that it would take strong apologetic arguments to hold their faith against modern philosophies. And that's also where you started to get the idea of, in the workplace or in the school or in the public square, the viewpoint started to be that religion was kind of like a little bit of an inappropriate topic, because it wasn't that way in early America. But because now it was being debated, it became like a topic of contention. And so how can we feel reasonably certain that our faith can withstand honest scrutiny?
Well, let's take up the fact that the earth had a beginning. As you mentioned at the start, up until 1929, the bulk of scientific philosophy and how they felt was all that the earth was a static state. It had always been here. They looked up in the sky, things didn't change, it seemed like, so they came to the conclusion that it's just always been here. Well, in 1929, Hubble looked through his telescope and found out that the universe had a red shift to it. It was stretching out. Anybody who's listening to this as a Christian should, when I hear that stretching out, the universe was stretching out, should bring to mind the fact that over and over and over again in both testaments, the Old and the New, both, that God says he is stretching out the heavens.
Right.
Now, when Hubble looked through his telescope, I don't think he came down to this, but when he looked through his telescope, he discovered two things. Number one, that the universe had to have a beginning. And number two, the reason for that is that the universe is being stretched out. Exactly what the Bible had been saying for over 1,500 years when Moses wrote it. Moses wrote it down. And up until 1929 is when man finally figured out, you know what? The Bible's right.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's right is what we just found out, because the universe is expanding. So at that point, I believe that the Christians starting to have a good argument for it. They may have had it, and maybe it was kind of obscure, but at that point, it became public because both Einstein and a gentleman named Fred Hoyle, both PhDs in astrophysics, they both came to the realization that they were wrong about the universe being a static state.
Right.
Einstein said it was his biggest mistake of his career, that he thought that, and came to the point where they started realizing, to much concern among the intellectuals, that the universe in fact did have a beginning. The fact that something has a beginning holds a huge implication that the atheists don't like, and secularism doesn't like, and materialism doesn't like, because something that begins to exist has a cause, a sufficient cause. You look out at the night. I love to go outside of my house and look up at the sky and the heavens and see God's glory, because it is produced there.
Right.
And when you see that and you look up in the heavens and you see the fact that it's all had a start, that changes things. It's not static state. It did have a beginning, and the idea of it coming in by chance, nothing creates itself. The universe is here, and it had a start. Those two facts should bring something to mind, that there's a difference here. The fact that it had a start at a certain point in time means it had a causal agent that could do that. Not only the sufficient power to do it, but the fact that he's going to make a decision to do it at a certain point. Whatever you think that is. I'm a young Earth creationist, but that really doesn't make a difference. It is 13.5 billion years old. It still had a start. Those two things we can talk about, but the big problem for the atheists is the fact that it did have a start. It doesn't matter how long ago it was, it had a start, and you have to explain that, and they can't.
And, you mentioned the word materialism, and if you look up a dictionary, it says that there's two definitions of materialism. One is just believing only in the material as opposed to believing in a God. Mm-hmm. The other would be focusing on money and status, and like focusing on goods instead of focusing on spiritual things or focusing on others. And it's supposedly viewed as like two different beliefs, or like two different definitions, but it actually kind of is combined, because if there is no God, then our focus just becomes on material things.
Grab as much as you can get, early as you can get it. And the morals behind getting your stuff, that doesn't really exist as long as you have stuff. Don't get me wrong, I got stuff too. But, I try my best to put God first, and God will bless. There's plenty of people in the Bible that were not poor people. Abraham, for example, was a very rich man.
Yeah, they say he was the richest man of his era.
David had plenty of material objects as well. So there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you keep it in its place. You have to keep the material objects in their place.
So going back a little bit to the Scopes trial, so a century later, the Scopes trial and the culture wars that followed have left us with a bitterly divided society, and it splits up families, workplaces, friend groups, and communities. And, in recent years, it seems like the culture wars were all going in the liberal direction. Now they're kind of going a little bit back in the conservative direction, but it doesn't have how it was before the culture wars. Of like there's a lot of bitterness related to that among the people today. And the New Testament tells us a lot about being gracious when we defend our faith. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how we can do that, of not compromising but not contributing to a lot of the bitterness that we see around us?
For sure. Well, I think the thing that Christians need to remember is that we want someone to come to us based on intellectual part, and so much that, but that we can be friends with them. We can care about them, and we have something to say with somebody lying on their deathbed. Somebody lying on their deathbed, what is an atheist going to say to them? You lived your life and now you're gone.
Right.
Good luck. But when it's a Christian philosophy and a Christian person can talk to people about the fact that we're going to have an eternal existence, and all the things that we can talk about as far as on an intellectual level makes it beyond a reasonable doubt that God does in fact exist, and the fact that he exists outside the time domain and space that we exist in. So you can come to someone that's on their deathbed, like I've done just recently, a few days ago, and talk to them about the fact that this isn't the end. This stuff here is going to perish.
Yeah.
But this isn't. What our minds, our thoughts, our loves, and everything else is going to continue on, whereas that materialistic idea that we have with secularism and all the rest, it comes to the point where there's going to come a point in your life when that doesn't really make it for you, like many of people have done. Many of the main Christian authors have had that experience.
Yeah.
Lee Strobel, who wrote Case for Christ. He was a committed atheist. His wife became a Christian, which he hated the fact that she did, and just blew up all over the place. But as he searched through trying to make his wife believe that Christ doesn't exist, he came to the very direct point that in fact he does exist. And he came to his wife and said that he was, after all his research was done, he was a Christian. His wife just about fell on the floor, because she was shocked that actually happened. She'd been praying for him, but it was shocked that actually happened. Now Lee Strobel is one of the biggest authors in Christianity to give examples of why we believe. And that's came around since the 60s, that we were able to defend our faith when Watson and Crick found out that the DNA molecule was actually an information-rich molecule. At that point, evolution should have died on the spot right then.
Right.
Evolution should have just been thrown out into the dirt. This is the fact that there's an coded instruction resident in DNA. That should have killed evolution, but it doesn't. My story about evolution is it's like the Dawn of the Dead movies that Hollywood makes. The fact that those people can walk around without muscle attachments, without a brain to give it any sense of motion, any sense of reality. Those Dawn of the Dead movies, they're science fiction, right?
Right.
And evolution, to me, that's what it is. It's putting something out there that has no foundations to it, but if you put it in front of everybody long enough, they'll start believing in it. How many Dawn of the Dead movies they've made now? 10 or 12? None of it makes any sense, but people still go see it. Now, I compare that, the reason I compare that is there's no evidence for that fact, that dead can get up. There was one that did it, maybe a couple that Jesus did, but the fact that the dead can walk around and do things, that's nonsense, right? So why do you think that something like evolution that has no proof behind it, you believe? Why would you think that? I don't understand why.
And just briefly talking about resurrection, because that's such an important topic too, but I will keep it very brief because that could easily become a couple hours.
Yes.
But only Jesus rose from the dead in the sense of being part of our resurrected existence that we'll have in the future. Mm-hmm. The other people who Jesus raised, it's more like they were brought back to this earthly life.
And they were going to die again.
Like when someone's resuscitated today, more along that line. But Jesus, he was brought back from the dead in a glorified state. And that he's the first fruits. He's the first person to experience that.
Right.
So before we conclude this, I just also want to mention too, you've come back from a very interesting trip. You went to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. And so there's 3 places in the world today where there are replicas of Noah's Ark, not just like a tiny little like children's book version of it, but like a replica of, the Ark was a massive aircraft carrier type of barge structure.
Right.
And the 3 places would be Kentucky, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands. I don't think you've been to the other 2.
I haven't been to the other 2, no, but the one that's in Kentucky, I strongly encourage anybody to go see that because it is incredible. And not just the Ark Encounter, but it's also got the Creation Museum, which also has a ton of stuff that will encourage your faith. And if you decide to defend your faith in a friendly manner, you make a friend with an atheist, and you can talk to him in a manner that you can portray the fact that you care about him. You care enough about him to be able to share with him about what he thinks is true and what you think is true. And if you can bring up some topics that make him think, well, maybe that's not true. Yeah. Maybe I have looked at this in the wrong manner. But the main thing is that you do care about them. And I think that's what draws people to Christ, is the fact that we do care enough to talk to people about the truth.
And I think it's interesting too with those. And let me also ask you. So, what did you like the most about the Ark encounter? What did you find the most impressive?
Just the boat itself, but the fact that the people that are involved with this, they're not just making a point an important point, that Noah's Ark did really exist, but they're making that point, the fact to bring out the fact that Christ is the one that it's all pointing towards.
Yeah.
Noah's Ark, that idea is the fact that those people that got onto the ark, you could think that they were actually being baptized.
Yeah, Peter talks about that.
Into the faith, because everywhere else was water, everything else died except for, of course, the fish, and these were the people that survived, and they were the ones that restarted life on the earth. But it's also, on one particular point, they've got these huge doors that the cattle and all the animals came into. But on these doors, you can take a picture of yourself, and above the doors, a cross. And that's my biggest thing that I like about the Ark encounter. It's not just telling you about Noah's Ark, which is great that that's the case, but it's also bringing out the fact that Christ did die for us, and that his story is factual. And they're very, very specific and instructional about doing that, about sharing the gospel along with the rest. They do it for kids. Kids are free. Any kid that's under 10 years old is free to get in. So they make it as kid-friendly as they can, but it's also got enough stuff that kids are not really going to get, that to be able to keep the adults interested in as well, giving reasons to believe.
And there's a good contrast too of as flawed as our country is and as much trouble as there is in our country. When you look at the Hong Kong Ark exhibit there,
Mm-hmm.
the developer who built that, Hong Kong now is under communist Chinese control, and he was thrown in jail for 5 years. And it's they actually left the Ark there though, interestingly. But like, you're not really supposed to teach in the Chinese communist system. You're not supposed to teach about Genesis or about end times.
Mm-hmm.
But that does go to show of, like, at least in the U.S. there is more freedom. Yeah. As much division as there is still more freedom than what we see there. Have you been to Dayton, Tennessee, by the way, where the Scopes trial happened? Because I know that is somewhat of a tourist site as well.
I haven't. I don't even know where. I've been to Tennessee plenty of times, but I've never had the idea to go to Dayton. That'd be interesting to go. Yeah.
I think so too.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like there's not that much there. It's a small town, so I think they like to relive the Scopes trial a lot because it gives them a claim to fame.
Sure, absolutely. That's a good claim to fame.
Yeah. So thank you, Kelly, for speaking with us about the Scopes trial and its significance and how it changed our country. And our nation and the world is a different place than it was before these changes. But it's important to remember that the Lord is still the Lord of history, and he's still moving history forward to accomplish his ultimate goal of redemption.
And he still has his plan, and his plan is for people to understand and know him, to get into a personal relationship with him. And the reason why we do apologetics is to try to give the idea that you don't have to you check your brain at the door. When you come into a church, you do not have to check your brain at the door. Walk in, see what the message is, and research it.
Yeah.
Like I did. When I first came to faith, I was 43 years old when I did, and I had all kinds of problems with it, but I also wanted it to be true. But I asked God, I said, okay, well, I'm good with this, but please show me how this to be true. And those are just honest questions. I wasn't backing off. I wasn't having my arms folded in front of me or like this. I was open to it. And that's all you got to be, is open to it.
Yeah.
And when you are open to it, the evidence all lands on one side. Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. He did that about 2,000 years ago, and he's alive today, and he wants a relationship with you.
And Kelly, you're proof too of, a lot of the statistics. They always say, 99% of people who come to faith in Jesus, they were raised in it, or they come to faith like the latest possible would be like college age. Mm-hmm. And you were in the middle of your life and you came to the Lord, and that can happen. There's a lot of people at the Packing House Church here who have that experience, and it's encouraging. It reminds us that no one's beyond God's reach.
God's can reach, no doubt about it. Sometimes it takes a big board in the forehead, like he did with me, but he will do that rather than you end up in hell.
So thank you so much, and have a great summer.
Just for the fact on the shirt, in case you guys didn't see it, might want to advertise like that. All right. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too.